Hello and welcome. This is Katarian Lightning, and today we're going to be discussing the Tenet media situation. Now, if you haven't been following along with the news, basically what happened is that Tenet media went and took $10 million from a Russian-aligned businessman to go and spread Russian talking points, Russian propaganda. Who are Tenet media? Well, basically, Tenet media are a new right organization, and by new right, I mean the form of right wing that you would, for example, associate with MAGA, these sorts of groups. So basically, it is opposed to the traditional right, the neoconservatives, and also the alt-right. And mentality-wise, of course, they're most similar to the alt-right, and sometimes people use alt-right to go and describe them, but really these groups tend to very much distinguish themselves from the alt-right, so I'm just going to go and call them the new right, all right? So, who are Tenet media? Well, they're led by Lauren Chen, who of course you'll know as a woman who has been associated with various different forms of conservative media, and of course, as these things go, over the years she went and very much radicalized herself. Basically, she is most prominently associated with Turning Point USA, which is Charlie Kirk's operation. It's basically one of these new right organizations. This is very much the political version of this, whereas this Tenet media is more of the social media influencer version. So prominent people otherwise in Tenet media include Tim Pool, Lauren Southern, David Rubin, and Benny Johnson. So these are the four major ones. There's also two other guys, but they're not as prominent. So I'll talk about them, but they're not really going to factor in as much this. But you'll notice that there are definitely some very big names there, like Tim Pool has 1.4 million subscribers on YouTube. So very influential person as far as the right wing is concerned. I think one of the probably like the top 10s, right? Like not quite on the level of like a Tucker Carlson, but very influential still. All right, and yeah, so these groups, they went and took Russian money to go and promote Russian talking points. Now, in the U.S. government document which talks about this, they say that these people are, of course, were largely duped into it. The only one that they really go and point at the finger at is Lauren Chen for being the one who took the money and didn't really ask any questions about it. But of course, I'm going to somewhat dispute that because, of course, they'll say that because they don't really have any sort of, I guess, direct evidence that the people like Tim Pool, Lauren Southern, these people have gone and taken Russian money to go and promote Russian talking points. Basically, what happened is that these people were all paid money to go on various different podcasts. So, in the case of Tim Pool, for example, it was like $100,000, right, per show that he was being paid to go on. Again, this is Russian-directed money, and so they're paid to go on it, paid to promote these podcasts, and then they're supposed to, go and, well, essentially act as an influence operation. And of course, none of them ever, apparently, according to the U.S. government, they're all dumb enough that they never ask, oh, why am I getting $100,000 for going on this show? Well, again, it's like stuff. But what I'm going to go and show you throughout this, though, is that I'm very doubtful about the veracity of that statement. So, basically, all these people, from the point on, from like 2022 onwards, okay, have gone hyper down the promotion of Russia. They've been hyper promoting them. And it's very odd because, they're using all the same talking points. So all of these new right types, right, they're using the same talking points. They're going over the same rhetoric, the same things that they're pointing at. Like, this is something that is very indicative of a large influence operation. And if you want to say that's being run out of China, if you want to say that's being run out of Russia, or if you'd prefer to say, well, that's just the new right being this whole collective and they've decided to go and promote Russia, you can make that choice. I'm actually going to go and start out here, all right, by showing you something. This is just something I want you to go and consider, and we're going to use this as a talking point going forwards. So this is Turning Point USA, which again, this is the new right organization that a lot of these people are affiliated with. And yes, the Turning Point USA organization has been very rapidly purging a reference of Lauren Chen from its site. But yes, she was associated with them. So just remember that. Okay. And they use the same sort of talking points, generally speaking. Like, the only one they really differ on is Israel, but we'll get to that later, right? So, but here, this is Turning Point USA. This is from their Twitter account. This was posted on February 25th, 2022. All right, and here we see Jack Posobiec. Remember, I've talked about this guy before. You'll know him. He covertly runs an account on Twitter called End Wokeness, okay? And basically, he's been hardcore against Ukraine for at least a year and a half, okay? So, year and a half, okay? So, these are the sorts of dates we're looking at. So, what changed? But look at this. February 25th, 2022. Russians are standing up against the regime despite the fact that doing so will cost them. God bless those protesters. Jack Posobiec. Russians are standing up against tyrannical invasion of Ukraine. And this is talking about people in Russia who, you remember, during those early months of the war, there were people who were going out and protesting against the war, and then Putin hardcore cracked down on them. And here we have Turning Point USA and Jack Posobiec, and they're promoting these Russians that are acting against Putin. They're saying these are good people. They're standing up against the tyrannical invasion of Ukraine. So here's the question. What changed in just a little over 2 years? And it's not even that, right? It was like under a year. What changed for them to go and flip their positions so drastically that they basically go and say, we're going to just start ranting against Ukraine hardcore, which is going to be ranting against Ukraine all the time? What changed between February 25th, 2022 and the positions that they hold now? Again, this is a very short frame of time. It doesn't appear like there's anything that's really happened which would change the actual, veracity of each side, or lack thereof in the case of Russia. So what has happened to make these people turn like this? And it even gets a little bit stranger here, because we're going to look at Benny Johnson a bit later, but I'm going to actually this is just a clarification, right? So this is Benny Johnson. This is during the Euromaidan protests in Ukraine, and he is hardcore criticizing Vladimir Putin. Here, look, Vladimir Putin is being presented as Gollum from the Lord of the Rings, obsessed with that ring of power. The internet is really not scared of Vladimir Putin. And look, he's working for BuzzFeed at the time, okay? So that's a relatively mainstream news source, right? And this is what Benny Johnson is doing at the time. So 10 years ago, he's hardcore critical of the various different forms of he's hardcore critical of the Russian interventions. So, Ukraine protests topple Lenin statue, smash it to bits with sledgehammer. Soviet monuments in Ukraine painted in national colors, gets girl. Insane photo of a Lenin statue being toppled and smashed with sledgehammers in Ukraine last night. Alright. Russia recruited civilian men to invade Ukraine, deleted all their records, gave them weapons, sent to certain death. Benny Johnson has strong opinions on situation in Ukraine. All those big pro-Russian rallies in Ukraine, apparently those are Russian citizens bussed in for the occasion. Alright? Punk rock Euromaidan graffiti in eastern Ukraine. Pro-Russian protesters are now killing their opposition in Ukraine. This is not a peaceful occupation. So look at that. Look at what is happening here, right? So 10 years ago, Benny Johnson is one of these Tenet media people. He's hardcore against what Putin is doing. He's hardcore saying this is evil. He's pointing out what they're doing. They're, the murders they're committing in this. So, and we'll go over here. Steps to keeping your online information secure. Don't send to Anthony Weiner. Don't send to Anthony Weiner. Don't give to Russia. All right? Trump live on Fox News. The Russia is... Okay. So, and this is actually where it starts to get into the whole Trump and Russia thing, right? All right. So basically, this is where the Russian accusations were coming in. Okay. But even down here, he notes Michael Moore participated in Russia-sponsored anti-Trump rally. So remember, like, originally, back way in the day, right? There were actually some anti-Trump socialist movements that were being sponsored by Russia, right? Like there were some stuff like that. I know that nowadays we talk about the whole difference of the whole situation now, but it's like, what changed to go and make them go from one point to the other, right? Very big question. So what has changed in 6 years that you're going to go and point this out and then to going and hardcore promoting Russian propaganda? So actually, this is actually a good point we'll go and look at. Here's the thing though. Look at the sort of numbers that they're getting, right? These aren't very good numbers that they're getting on these posts, right? And this is back when it was, look, like, just not good post numbers, right? So back here when he was working for BuzzFeed, like, he's getting 9 retweets, right? 4 likes, 1 comment. Like, again, not very good numbers. So what changed to go and take these people from acting like this to the way they're acting now? All right, so before we begin our analysis of the various different Tenet media, I would like to go and put forward a theory about the new right, and this will help us understand what we're looking at going forwards. And to discuss that, I would like to go and first outline what we're looking at with the idea of conservatism and progress, all right? So basically, conservatism and progress, so these are different wings, right? They each have their own virtues that we can go and look at, and they have their own drawbacks. And I'd like to outline a positive theory of both and then also a negative theory of both, and just tell you what exactly those positive and negative traits can look like. As with always, the reality is that if you go and take either mentality to the extreme, well, you end up with a lot of different problems. And actually, the interesting thing about that is, of course, we have the idea of the horseshoe theory nowadays, right? Where it's like the center tends to be more similar to one another, and then the extreme poles actually tend to also be more similar to one another, right? So it's kind of a weird thing, but you'll understand this when we go forward, because basically in the situation of a society that is based in the center, you essentially, the poles tend to view themselves both as being very much out of line with the center, and so they tend to both form dissident parties, and so that's where their similarities come from, even their tendency to go and work together. But we'll get into that a bit later. So first up, though, what are the positive values of conservatism historically? Well, the idea of conservatism is that you go and essentially honor the past, you honor where you came from, so you honor the tree where you came from, and that those virtues that you learned there, so, you know, the things that you've become, the things you've been raised to be, the things that you can go and look back and say, this is what we as a society did in the past, this is what we as a nation or a country did in the past. And looking back, we can go and be inspired by that, and that is what will move us forward to the future. So fundamentally, that is the idea of conservatism. So honor of tradition, honor of where you came from, honor of your society, and then you go and use that as an inspiration to go and move forwards. All right? And then you have progress, which is, progress looks entirely different. It looks at the world and says, I want to go and experience new things, new sensations. I want to go and make new discoveries, go to new places, see new things, sometimes even become new things, right? This is fundamentally the idea of progress. So it's a very futuristic looking movement, so it doesn't really have much use for the past. And it goes and says, we want to go and be what we're becoming in the future, and we're not really going to be too focused on the past. Now, the issue with both of these, basically, these are the different ways that humans can, I think, experience the world just as a very broad spectrum, right? So the issue with both of these is that when taken to the extreme, well, you look at traditionalism, right? Where you have this idea that, oh, we are going to go and be so hyper-focused on the past, and basically this can go and lead to regression, degeneracy, stagnation, right? Where it's like, we're only going to be focused on the past. We're looking back at the past glories. The future doesn't really hold much interest for us. We're just so obsessed with the past that we're just going to keep looking there and looking there, right? And then you have the progressive, right? Where you have the idea of progress. And, well, the issue with that can be that what is grounding you as you're looking towards the future? Like, do you understand yourself? Do you understand where you came from, what you're representing? And oftentimes you get into this whole notion where perhaps we can express this via the religious sentiment of being cut off from your tree and then grafted onto another tree. This could perhaps be taken as a very progressive idea, right? Where you're going and saying, I so don't care about the past that I am going to go and do something and become something entirely different. And the thing too is that it's like, why are you interested in becoming, different? Why are you interested in doing different things? And oftentimes the answer becomes, I'm interested in doing them for change themselves, right? The idea that change is always a positive, change is good. And it's this idea that you simply don't have an understanding of why you're doing change, right? All right, so briefly, I would like to go and outline what the New Right is, what their New Right conservative creed is, all right? So basically, we'll start off with fear-based consensus. So basically, they want their followers to go and be constantly afraid of things like World War III with Russia, migrants pouring across the border, this or that the Democrats or whoever else are doing in the country. This is what they want their people to look at and then constantly be in a state of fear and panic. And then that way they will go and garner votes from people. They'll garner very fanatical support from people because people are afraid. And it's like, oh, if you don't go and vote us in this election, well, the Democrats are going to go and install communism throughout the U.S., right? Like, that's one of their talking points, for example. And, Comrade Kamala Harris and all these sorts of things, right? This is all garbage, right? But they want people to go and constantly be in a fear-based consensus.
And look at what's happening to the towns all over the United States. And a lot of towns don't want to talk. It's not going to be Aurora or Springfield. A lot of towns don't want to talk about it because they're so embarrassed by it. In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats. They're eating the pets of the people that live there. And this is what's happening in our country, and it's a shame.
And actually, this works as well for Russia, right? Because people who are in a fear-based consensus, some of them can get deeply political, but a lot of people are also just going to end up in that state where they're looking at society and they're paralyzed. They're afraid to move, like they're afraid to vote. They're afraid to go and do anything, to go and try and do anything, because it's like, oh, well, we're up against forces that are vastly too powerful for us. So we can't do anything against them. We're just going to go and sit here and be miserable and talk on the internet, essentially, right? And then that goes and promotes more depression, more fear, more anxiety. And it goes and feeds all of these different influence operations where they can go and then garner money from them. You see all these different streamers, right, from the New Right, and they've all got their little super chats up and running where they can go and garner money from their viewers and just, a bunch of different garbage, right? So, fear-based consensus, no belief in universal morality, only social Darwinism. That's completely ironic, isn't it, from a group which calls itself, we're the base traditionalists, we're the ones who have the morality over the new pagans. Well, actually, what's happened is that their morality is that of supremacism, which is that one group has the moral right to the world, and then because they have the moral right to the world, well, they then get to do basically whatever they want, right? Whatever they want in the world. So that's why Russia can go and invade Ukraine, and they'll go and say, well, why is Ukraine fighting back? Why is Ukraine fighting back? Why are they going up against Russia? Because Russia is the center of Christianity in the world, right? And then we can go and then look at when Ukraine goes and invades Russia, and then suddenly all these groups are very angry because it's like, oh, how dare Ukraine go and invade Russia when Russia's literally already invaded Ukraine, is occupying large swaths of the country, right? It's like, this is what we're looking at. And then the social Darwinist element comes in, where they basically have this sort of philosophy where it's like, oh, we don't have to go and help anyone in the world. We just have to go and help ourselves, because, whoever is good over there, well, whoever is strong, well, they'll be the ones that survive, and then we'll go and deal with the other strong people in the world, right? That's basically the sort of mindset that they have. And that goes into all how they view the world, and how they support different countries in the world, how they go into line with different countries in the world. And of course, most of the types in the US specifically have this deep isolationist streak to them, right? Where they don't want to go and do anything. They just want America to be very silent. And we're going to go and see how insanely much that goes to in the future. All right, then political polarization, which is make every single issue politically polarized. And then, so you look at, for example, what happened with Congress in this past year, right? So basically, Trump had the Republicans go and stall out a bunch of aid bills for Israel and Ukraine and Taiwan. And he did it because he's like, the constant talking point that he heard was, oh, well, our border is open. Well, they won't do anything about the border. Why aren't we doing anything for these different countries, right? And that was the constant talking point from the Republican, different political people, right? But then you go and say that the Democrats had said, okay, well, we're going to go and toss in a border bill. So enhanced border security. We're going to go and get a bunch of different judges so we can go and rapidly process asylum cases and see who deserves asylum, who doesn't. And then, well, lo and behold, Trump goes and says, oh, I hate that because that's going to make me look bad. That's actually going to be fixing the issue. And then he has the Republicans in Congress go and stall that out too. And so then what essentially happens is that they have to go and peel off different parts of the bill, then which it was originally unified on the request of the Republicans to go and unify it. So then they go and peel off different parts of the bill, and so then they go and pass the aid bill separately. And then the Republican influencers, these new right influencers, go and say, well, oh, look, they wanted to go and strip off the parts about defending the border. They didn't care about the border. They just wanted to go and get these bills out there. They just wanted to go and deceive us. And just like all this garbage, right? So basically, they polarize every single issue, including issues that do not need to be polarized, and they do that for their own political gain, and they do that even to the harm of the country around them. All right, so again, this is the traits of the new right. These are not going to be exclusively the traits of the new right. There are elements of these are also true of the new left and sometimes even the center, but these things all come together in the new right, and it's what makes them such a well, if they didn't have their influence, you'd say that they were comical, but they unfortunately do have some influence. So promotion of amoral mercantile greed. So you look at your Elon Musk's, your David Sachs of the world, these venture capitalists, and why do they go and promote places like Russia? Well, they have business ties to Russia, and this is Europe is even more infected with this, right? Where there are tons and tons of different parts of the European capitalist establishment that just go and work with Russia, and they just want to go and essentially force their governments to try and peace out with Russia because they just want to go and greedily suck up natural resources and then go and use them in their various different mechanisms. And of course, that's all influenced too because a lot of the capital that is coming in comes in from Russian oligarchs as well, right? So there's a very big deal with this corruption and mercantile greed. Then we have linguistic controls, and these come from 4 different places. And so this is going to be the concept of using language to determine how the followers of the new right think, right? And this is something, by the way, that all fanatical organizations do, okay? So basically, they want you to have they don't want you really to have a rational analysis of different points, right? They're not very smart people as a whole. What they want you to do is have emotional feelings and sensations about different issues. And so what they do there is that they go and say, okay, we're going to go and talk about an issue. You're going to go and feel strongly about it. You're going to feel outrage, or you're going to feel fear, or you're going to feel elation. And you're constantly going to be going through these sort of emotional sensations when you go and look at the world, when you read the news. And it will go and essentially come to a point where you're bypassing your rational thought. But of course, because these are also very cultic mentalities, they also go and say, they try and go and present people like they're joining some sort of political, ideological elite by going and aligning themselves with the movement, right? Where everyone else on the outside are sheeple and stupid, but you're smart. You're smart for being here with us, right? That's sort of what they're going and saying. And so in terms of where this linguistic conditioning comes from, so we have the meme language, right? So you have like the base term, or you have all these different little meme terms, like meme images that they share, right? Your Woyaks, your Pepes, all these sorts of memes that they trad girl, trad man. You see these all throughout Twitter. Yes, they're starting to become played out simply because of the fact that they've been politicized to this extent, right? But you're still going to see them for a while, I think. Two, you have the pseudo-traditionalist language. So this will be like Christ is king. Like that's the big term I've heard recently. And then, of course, you have like a bunch of other different traditionalist elements, or again, pseudo-traditionalist elements, because for various reasons, these forms of like Christianity that they're talking about, not exactly traditionalist, but we could get, that's something that's a whole other issue, right? A whole other discussion for another day. You have the adapted leftist and communist language. Now, this especially comes out of libertarianism, okay, where you have libertarians who have gone and adopted terms like anti-war, American imperialism, Western imperialism, NATO imperialism. And these all come out of the historic leftist and communist speak, right, where they're trying to go and get, this is the speak that they use to try and paralyze the Western countries to prevent them from acting, colonialism, all these sorts of things. These are adopted by libertarianism, even though you go the libertarian background, right, and they're basically all like these ultra far right guys where they're, advocating for political separation, things like, oh, we hate Abraham Lincoln, we love the Confederacy, right? Like these are unironically stuff that they believe in, just crazy stuff. And then finally, the fourth one there we have are the modern Russian talking points. So these come out of guys like Alexander Dugin, where you have global hegemony, right? You have American hegemony, multipolar world, monopolar world, global south. These are all their talking points, and they want you to go and think in these terms, right? Even though all these terms are lunacy. I mean, I went to like this big talk in a previous video about the issues with that whole multipolar world concept, right? Where you go and look at what the Russians mean by multipolar worlds, and they literally want imperial countries to go and dominate all of the smaller countries around them and essentially form like these poles in the world, right? So it's like the Indian pole, the Russian pole, the Brazilian pole, the South African pole, the Iranian pole, and it's like they go and essentially control all of the different countries around them. And just it's used to justify imperialism, and then everyone goes and uses it like it's this anti-imperialist term, right? It's sandy, right? But that's what you're looking at, and all these different words are used to go and control how people think and how they experience the world, how they experience what they see. Then we have promotion of ignorance, and so this is what I'm talking about when we look at, like, for example, we need to go and return to traditional Catholicism or traditional Christianity. It's like you're advocating for promotion of a return to discredited ideas. And this is especially true even on a more extreme extent, right, where you see like what they're doing in Iran, for example. It's like we need to go and return to a time when, 9-year-old girls could get married. It's like I don't... There's very little words to describe just how stupid all of these different ideas are that they're throwing around. But again, it's like the justification is like return to tradition. Well, guess what? These traditions they are talking about, these pseudo traditions, they're actually degenerate forces in society. They're not these forces of life like you go and constantly proclaim them as. We have extreme hierarchical mentalities, where you have this contempt of democracy, this contempt of the average person, this presentation that the average person is stupid. And meanwhile, this is as you're going and saying, oh, Trump has was the most popular president by votes and all that sort of thing. And it's like, well, which is even that's an absurd talking point, right? Because it's like you look at Trump and, it's like you literally lost the popular vote to Hillary Clinton, and then you lost the vote again to Joe Biden. And it's like, well, what exactly are you talking about when you're saying you're the most popular president? It's like, really, you're more of a fluke because the electoral districts can't be perfect. And so that's simply the reality of the situation, So, yeah, you got in, but it's like it's more just a fluke that the electoral districts weren't exactly apparently configured properly to go and let that happen, because you have, again, like excess. And then it should be stated, like, this is something that happens from time to time in places where you have two parties, right, where it's like you can go and win with less votes, because obviously you could, for example, have 3 districts in the running and you win 2 of the districts by 51%, and then you lose the 3rd district like 99% to 1%, and then that would technically give more voters who voted against you, but you would then win by basis of having won 203 districts, right? So that sort of thing can happen, and it's a very difficult thing to go and account for in the current political order of the world, but it is what it is, right? All right. Subculture. Okay, this is one that's very dear to my heart. I'm going to have to make a big video about this someday, I know, but basically the idea of the politicized subculture is that you go and take a bunch of people, you move them over to a subculture. Now this can be a subculture that revolves around ethnicity, religion, political ideology, gender, sexuality. It can be almost anything, right? And basically then you go and, if you're a force that wants to go and use that against society, you go and say, well, now we're going to have this subculture, and then we're going to come up with a way so that it is an us versus them situation. So it's the subculture versus society. And this is what the new right goes and does to its followers, right? Where they want them to go and disassociate themselves from society, to go and say, oh, society is your enemy, the government is your enemy, the people around you, they're your enemy, or they're stupid, they're the tools of the government. These are the things they want people to go and believe in, right? So it's like a subculture versus a society, okay? So very important idea. Degeneracy, and I'm going to use that in a very specific way with the new right. So basically what they want, right, is that they want you to be one of two things, and this is especially true if you're a young man who's interested in the new right? Okay, so they want you to either be so depressed with the idea of dating, right? They want to go and promote you these ideas that, oh, women are all, slutty, and they're all promiscuous, and they're all unfaithful. They're all going to go and fool around on you. You're going to just be miserable if you go try and do a sort of dating. And so they want to go and promote that to you, and then your response is going to be, oh, I'm depressed, I'm just going to go and immerse myself in the new right talk, and I'm just going to go and keep going, and if I do any dating, it's going to be casual. And so the end result is that you're a miserable person who does not engage in the family building act that can go and create social responsibilities, or someone who fundamentally remains without responsibilities. The new left, by the way, does this to perhaps an even greater extent in a lot of ways, where they want and this is what their gender obsession, where they basically have a whole bunch of people who will never go and be mature, and so then they can go and constantly be used in immature ways where they don't have to go and care about social repercussions for what they do, because again, they don't have like families and that sort of thing. So that's one way that the new right wants to get you. The alternative is that the new right says, oh, go to church, go and get yourself a conservative church girl, go keep attending church, go and keep advocating for a church, and then you'll get into this whole political paradigm where you're surrounded by people who are constantly affirming your various choices in life. They're affirming, oh, you should go and be in the new right, etc., 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 and that's fundamentally what you're going to be looking at there, right? And that's very that's essentially what they're using the church for nowadays. All right. We have abandonment. Okay, this is another big one where it's like go and abandon your friends and your political friends. Go and say we don't care about what happens to Taiwan. We won't honor our deals with Ukraine. We won't honor our deals with Israel or etc. We're just going to go and say, well, we'll cut all these different parties loose and we don't care what happens to them. If anything, they're bringing us into conflict with our bigger opponents. And you know what? That just means that really, if you think about it, right, if you think about it in this very twisted little new right way, well, places like Ukraine, they're actually our enemies because, they have the chance of getting us into a war with Russia. And you know what? That would be a bad thing, right, for us. Bad. So, Ukraine is really our enemy if you go and think about it, right? They're the ones that are responsible for this whole thing. And we don't need to go and align ourselves with this various different mess.
But I don't know that it matters anymore. This is psychotic. Ukraine is the enemy of this country. Ukraine is our enemy, being funded by the Democrats. I will stress this again. One of the greatest enemies of our nation right now is Ukraine. They are expanding this war.
All right, so abandonment. And then thuggery. I talked about this with this whole mercantile greed element where it's like, oh, we're going to go and suddenly say, we're going to essentially go around and we're going to talk about getting protection money from various different places in the world. And this is what Trump does, right? So he goes around and says, oh, if you won't give us like a trade deal that's super in our favor, well, we're not going to go and protect you anymore with the American military. So essentially the American military becomes used as a tool for thuggery and mercantile greed and essentially enforcing these things. Just absolutely trash, right? Then you have moral paralysis. So what is moral paralysis? Well, basically moral paralysis wants you to go and is where these guys go and say, we want all of the different strong nations that are opposed to groups like Russia and China. We want them morally paralyzed so that they are incapable of acting in the world. We want them to be at the point where they have such extreme social doubts in their minds that they don't want to go and do anything. They don't want to go and act out when they see these evil acts going on in the world. We want them to just be isolationists, to go and stay huddled to themselves, right? So you see this, for example, like in Germany, for example, where it's like Germany can go and look at what Russia is doing. And this is clearly something that is very much a callback to Nazism, right? Where like Russia insists that they have the right to go and conquer all of the different Rus peoples and then absorb them into themselves. This is the idea fundamentally of Nazism, right? And so Germany can go and look at that. They will recognize that psychologically speaking as being Nazism. They're post-Nazism doctrinally nowadays, right? But what happens is that they're so morally paralyzed because people tell them, oh, you've had like this history with Nazism. And then that paralyzes them to the point where they won't act to go and help out the world that's around them now, right? And so this is why you see this partial paralyzation in Germany. And the same thing happens in the different Western countries where it's like people are pointing out, you have this colonialist history. Ergo, don't say anything while the Chinese are colonizing Africa nowadays, right? Don't say anything when the Russians are going and literally mass killing Africans for the sake of their various different business and mining ventures. Like, don't say anything because you are colonialists. Don't go and point out and try and stop the evils in the world around you nowadays because, you did this bad thing long time ago, right? Paralysis. That is what moral paralysis looks like. And this is where they're getting at in the new right. Again, moral paralysis is something that is even more a term, I'd say, that applies to the new left, which is ridiculous as far as the extent they take moral paralysis to. But the new right does it in their own way, right, where they want people to go and be isolationists, and they're just justified on using different rhetoric, but it fundamentally gets you to the same place, which is a very important point. All right, and then finally, though this is going to be a bit of a discussion, but whiteness, okay? So what do I mean by whiteness? Well, I'm not going to use this stupid little academic nonsense, right? This nonsensical academic use of the term. But basically, we should understand that there are ethnic mascots for different ideologies. right? And for the new right, that is very much what they have identified as the white race, which, as I talked about before, it does not exist. Again, go look up the genetic groups that are descend from males and females in the world, okay? There is no justification for there being a white race. Like, there's just, there isn't there. There can be genetic similarities between people from Europe. That's fine, okay? But I think that's even less than what you think it is. So just keep that in mind, please. And there's also, we've of course found out that, there are also, like, India, for example, like, lots of genetic relations to Europe, even Native Americans. Like, you look up, there's a big relationship to Western European men there, right? Like, these are actual connections that exist. And then you go and say, like, okay, so your average Western European man is actually more genetically similar to, like, a Native American man than he is to a Greek or like a Swedish man. Like, these indeed are the sort of things that you really have to go and look at, right? It's like suddenly your idea about what race looks like doesn't really go and fit. And yes, granted, like with that example, like, yes, the maternal lines in Europe are going to look more similar, than that's the big difference, right, between, like, the Native Americans and the Europeans, which is this maternal lineage, right? But the point still stands, though, that, and especially given that a lot of this race stuff, right, is justified via the male lineages, right? That's the big focus. So basically, you're, though, dealing with stuff that you simply can't go and justify, right? So, but that doesn't really matter, because in the terms of how whiteness is used, the only point really is that whiteness is used as a way of distinguishing and separating people off into a subgroup that they can then go and be leveraged against society, right? So it's like, we'll go and use, and in case of whiteness, it simply is a constructed fake race, right? So that's what the new right is going to promote, which is like whiteness, white people versus society, okay? It doesn't work. And of course, you'll notice that that parallels, right, extremely well with what the far left does, right? Because the far left does the same thing. They just take a negative viewpoint of what they label as the white people, whiteness, that sort of thing, right? And of course, there are other different groups. Like, we can talk about how, African American culture used as a mascot by, like, progressives, and then also a lot of capitalist culture nowadays. Palestinians, of course, ethnic mascot for progressives now, progressives and Islamists. So these are other groups that we could talk about, but again, I'm not going to be focusing too much on this point. I just want to go and put out there that, this is a fact, that there is this sort of ethnic mascot going on here. All right, so that is my outlining of what the new right looks like, what their creed is essentially. And you'll notice there's a lot of gibberish in there. There's not a lot. It's mostly vagaries, and that is the point, right? It's intentionally kept very vague as to what they want for society. And yeah, there's just not a lot to go and work for. And it's like, oh, we're just going to be trying to put in a lot of the elements of tradition that we claim, this pseudo-tradition, and then we're going to incorporate all these talking points from libertarianism and that. All right. So I would then like to go and briefly return back to the Tenet, of course, right? So Lauren Chen is very much, who again is the owner of the Tenet media organization. So she very much has been on the cutting edge of a lot of what we've seen in terms of the various different cultural stuff that's been happening recently, where it's like there's this attempt by the new right to go, in America specifically, and also in other places, to go and destroy the usual conservatives, right? The conservatives and what they neoconservatives, alt-right too, right? They hate the alt-right. And I know that sounds odd to some people, but you go and look at what a guy like, say, Nick Fuentes says about the alt-right, right? He very much despises the alt-right, and so the alt-right is more just a punching bag term, and the new right also likes using it as a punching bag. So we should fundamentally focus on this new right idea, where we should perhaps adopt that as our term rather than the alt-right, again, just because of the differences between the two movements. But and again, I accept that they're similar in a lot of ways, but again, I'm just going to use the new right term here, okay? So one of the best examples of where this happened recently, which is with the new right going and ranting against the conservatives, right? So this was the Christ is King, where basically people were trying to go, various different people were trying to say that Ben Shapiro's organization, the Daily Wire, they want to go and say, oh, we need to go and get Ben Shapiro out of the right wing in the U.S., right? He needs to go and be marginalized and thrown out because he is an Orthodox Jew, he is a typical conservative, and he is someone who we want to go and throw out of our movement. We want him to go and be out, ostracized, and to do this, they used Candace Owens to start the Christ is King movement, all right? Which is where basically Candace Owens went and said, oh, I got fired from the Daily Wire for saying Christ is King because I offended the Jews, and the Jews are against Christianity, the Jews hate Christianity, and so we should go and separate ourselves out from the Jews. We should go and ostracize any sort of non-convert Jew from our organizations. You'll notice that exact same thing was happening, right, with progressives at the time, where, oh, you're Jewish, you're supportive of Israel, well, we're going to toss you out of the university, we're going to go and isolate you. You know, Shai David, right, he had that, the ridiculousness that he's been dealing with, so he's just become the forefront of that, right, where just tossed out of his university position, and then just ridiculous stuff. Also, for the sake of these progressives being able to go and make these various moral statements, to have their various different hate movements against Jews, and align themselves with the Islamists, of course, right? Where it's like a whole mess. But the new right was having this moment with Jews as well. And remember, this is something that is very controversial in the U.S., where like a lot of the population is very supportive of Jews. Conservatives, of course, have historically been very supportive of Jews, but this whole Tenet group and Candace Owens, they're very much anti-Israel. And of course, like I said, there's this is kind of the one big point that separates them from the TPUSA, right, where Charlie Kirk is more pro-Israel. Historically speaking, we'll see where that goes, but anyway, so the Christ is King controversy, where they want to go and frame it as Christians versus Jews. And Lauren Chen in particular has a lot of issues with Israel, so she's constantly talking against Israel, constantly talking against Zionism. And basically, she was one of the people who jumped in on this. We'll go and talk about those posts later on specifically. But we note that this was coordinated with. So we have Candace Owens, who again was the initiator of this. She was used, I should say, as the initiator, because then she got her own little gig that suddenly had a very high amount of popularity directed towards it, right? So Candace Owens was one of these people. Then we have Tim Pool. We had Jack Posobiec, Andrew Torba from Gab. We had Tucker Carlson, several high-ranking GOP members, including Thomas Massie. And then we also had other influencers that are aligned with these groups, like Andrew Tate, for example, jumping in and going and supporting them. So basically, this is what Lauren Chen does. Okay, she goes and promotes this, and then so fundamentally trying to go and get people to go and create this new us versus them of Christians versus Jews. Again, these types of those, it's all returning to this old degeneracy, right? It's reverting to this old stagnant bad ideas where, we have to go and hate the Jews now again because, our ancestors hated the Jews, right? So we're going to go and bring that back, and it's like we're going to go use them as scapegoats for all the different flaws in our society. This is stuff that's really happening, and it's just absolute garbage, and it's being propelled by it's being propelled by the new right. It's being propelled by the progressives, which again, there isn't much about progress anymore with those bunch. and they're allied with the Islamists, and the Islamists are, again, this fundamentally pseudo-traditionalist group that are degenerate, like just promote terrible things, like literally physically degenerate too in the case of the Islamists, right, where they're promoting cousin marriage, like first cousin. They're promoting child marriage, like just tons and tons of stuff that's going to be terrible for society, terrible for their intelligences too, right, where, it's been basically proven that if you're in a society that encourages stuff like first cousin marriage, where you're basically getting stupider and you're more violent towards outsiders, and you see all these things in the Islamists, right? So just terrible, terrible stuff. So it basically happens with the new right is that they've adopted the arguments and tactics developed by the von Mises Institute, Lew Rockwell, Ron Paul, the libertarians, and their cronies, essentially. These are the people who developed all the arguments and talking points and ways of interacting with society that are currently being used by the new right. And so what these groups did is that essentially they went and slammed together a bunch of the left talking points, and then they slammed that together with conservatism, essentially, or this new right take on conservatism, right? And so basically they portrayed themselves as benign, liberty-loving people, the harmless Ron Paul, the lovable Rand Paul, these sorts of things. But meanwhile, their followers are being indoctrinated into the terminology of left-wingism, communism, and then the far right too, right? So you have military-industrial complex, imperialism, American empire, anti-war, hegemony, Anglo-Saxon, global south, multipolar world, monopolar world. Again, all of these different terms, you're seeing them constantly thrown around by libertarians, right? And I'll note that all this is in support of the most authoritarian countries on the planet, okay? So libertarians are going and supporting them. So that gives you a hint that maybe these guys who are anarcho-capitalists, right? That's the final goal of these libertarian types, where it's like, well, maybe that's just so that they can go and be the biggest bully on the block, right? And then all this liberty stuff is just to get people dumb enough to go and support them on their little crusade there. All right, so then they argue for whoever is against the West and its interests, and America and its interests, right? That extended to historical opponents like the Confederacy, so they demonize Abraham Lincoln, right? They will take the position of the Central Powers in World War I. You see, like Patrick Buchanan, for example, argues, we should not have gone and intervened in World War I, right? So it's like they call themselves like the paleo conservatives, right? That's old conservatives. That's the element that's gone and been hammered together with the leftist talking points, okay? So like anti-interventionism, that sort of thing, those sorts of alleged conservative elements in America, right? And then more recently, like we've even seen Tucker Carlson, he just had a guy on promoting Hitler, right? He had a Palestinian guy on promoting why you should hate Israel. Like, these are literally what they're going for, right? So literally everything that you ever did as the West, as America, well, we want you to go and view that as being evil. And then because you view it as being evil, well, now you've gone and surrendered the moral legitimacy, the crown of moral right to the countries like Russia, China, Iran, okay? That's fundamentally what they want. And what that would do if you went and adopted those positions, right? So, and again, you can adopt this via the far right talking points, or you can adopt this via the far left talking points. But once you go and surrender that moral legitimacy, you then are paralyzed as a society. You'll accept whatever they want to do around the world. And of course, once they've gone and aligned the world with them, of course, they're going to come for you as well, right? Like, just that's the reality. They'll go and subvert your societies, get as many as they can on board, and then they'll go for the rest, right? That's just how it's got to be. All right, and then you'll notice that countries that are our friends, right? Ukraine, Israel, Albania, Taiwan, South Korea, Kosovo, they constantly argue against these countries in favor of countries that hate us, like, Russia, China, North Korea, Serbia. Like, they'll constantly argue for these countries, and they'll say, oh, well, these countries were actually in the right in all of our conflicts. Oh, look at how you Americans, like, oh, how could you do that? How could you stop the Serbians from going and committing genocide on the Bosniaks? Like, how dare you? Like, really, how dare you go and do that, right? It's like just absolute garbage, right? But that, again, go look up on LouRockwell.com if you don't believe me. Like, I'll do a piece on them eventually, but, like, you can literally find them hating on America constantly. Like, just talking about how much they hate our interests, right? Just absolutely disgusting, right? And then, of course, this all comes with double standards, right? Where it's like, oh, if America or the West does this one thing, well, we're going to go and say, oh, that's terrible. But if we go and do that thing, do that in a far more extreme sense, well, oh, that's perfectly fine. That's perfectly legitimate, right? Now, interestingly enough, this also factors into how they portray society. So, for example, on Twitter, you could go on a bunch of different, see a bunch of different accounts like Radio Genoa, for example, where it's like, oh, this is Moscow, and then they'll go and portray like a couple of Russian, teenagers like are dancing together in very formal outfits, and they'll go and be like, oh, this is harkening back to traditional Europe, and then they'll go say, oh, notice anything? What do you notice about this? And then they'll have a bunch of little bot accounts that come on and say, oh, look at how traditional and based Russia is, right? Meanwhile, of course, and then when they go into the West, right, it's like they'll go and take something like, oh, look at this guy who's parading around in like a dress and dog costume or something, right? A dog halter. And it's like, oh, look at the West. What you see there? It's like, yeah, that's something that is hyper ultra specific. And you know what, Radio Genoa and all those types that do that. Like, how about like going and me showing you some of those clips I have of Russia, like where a guy goes and randomly throws a grenade into an occupied playground just because he wants to go and put a joke on the kids and their mothers there, and they're just laughing because he's drunk all the time. Like, that's happened. I have a clip of that. I have plenty of clips of Russia that would make you feel, or like, arguing couples going and beating each other, right? Like, this is stuff that I could get out of Russia, and this is far more typical of what you're going to see in Russia than all that little base propaganda stuff that you're talking about, right? A lot of that's just orchestrated as well, just to go and give a cultural perspective. And it's like, okay, so it's like, I could get that in the West too, right? Like, I can go to like a ballet or something and get, refined, elegant dancers and that. Like, what's your point exactly? Like, there is no point here. Or like a traditional costume party, okay? Like, what does that prove? Like, that says nothing about your country. Like, yeah, so basically it's like, they want you to go and hyper obsess about the exceptions, and then they want you to go and be under this impression that, our society is one way, the societies we promote are this way, and that's why you should go and argue for these societies. And of course, your average person, they don't go do their research, right? Like, your average Twitter user, I should say. So they get sucked into this stuff real easy, and it's like, unless you go and actually look it up, which, there's no excuse for being ignorant in the modern day, okay? Like, you have the entire internet, okay? I know that the internet can be a place which has a lot of ignorance and disinformation on it, but reality is that there are a lot of people out there that are also fighting against that. So, yeah, just keep that in mind. And then finally, the talking point with, again, like Tenet media types, they're not going to explicitly come out and say, oh, we're hyper pro-Russia, we want Putin to win and overtake the West. But what they will say is, oh, we're against both sides, right? We're against both sides, but then they'll use tactics and advocate rhetoric, okay, that only serves to harm Ukraine and then justifies the Russian side. And they'll do this constantly while claiming to be a both-sider, okay? So, very dishonest, and this is what you are fundamentally looking at with these types, okay? And then one last thing I want to mention is that because there's a horseshoe here, we are actually going to see Lauren Chen cite far less sources, such as Michael Tracy, who is a far-left journalist, and then also Stop Cop City, which is like a far-left anarchist movement that was literally trying to go and do riots against police that were building a prison. Like, they just wanted to go and riot against that. And so it's this whole movement. And you're going to see Lauren Chen cite both of those types, okay? So just understand that this is what we're dealing with fundamentally here, okay? All right, so now that we've got that out of the way, I know that was a pretty long introduction, but I think it was important to lay out our framework here. We can now get started in analyzing these specific posts of these people, all right? So we'll get that. Once more, this is our paradigm that we're using, okay? A lot of these people used to say they were against Putin, okay? That they were more mainstream journalist types, okay? And even up to, again, like, yeah, and up to this point, right? Again, this is, again, new right, right? So we're apparently against Putin up until even 2022, or at least critical of him. Again, these people have made varying degrees of posts that may be supportive or against Putin at different points, but a lot of them are taking this as their talking point. So, yeah, we're going to be using this, though, as exemplar, okay?
It's dreadful, awful, the worst place around. So stinking, creaky, morally unprofound. This country's gone down the drain, and I'm ashamed to call it by name. Scream so much on Twitter, but still nothing seems to change. Getting really ticked off hearing something's gotta change. Things around here ain't perfect, and that's not right for me. Things around here ain't perfect, so let's burn the stage and street. Got a new game plan to shake things right up. You can play at dirty. Don't need clean hands, surely. I'm talking on the internet, engaging in free thought. People are talking shit, and my head bobs as I agree. Things around here ain't perfect, and that's not right for me. Things around here ain't perfect, so let's burn the stage and street. Got a new game plan to shake things right up. You can play at dirty, don't need clean hands, surely. You're talking on the internet, engaging in free thought. People are talking shit, and my head bobs as I agree. Got a new game plan to shake things right up. You can play at dirty, don't need clean hands, surely. You're talking on the internet, engaging in free thought. People are talking shit, and my head bobs as I agree. So now I figure I be poor, can get a sweet payout for spitting truths, and with bots I won't be ignored. Regretting your choices yet? I laugh at so-called countrymen. I don't owe you scum any loyalty time, cause you're the enemy to me, and the man in Moscow agrees. I'll call you Satan, you like how that sounds. I'll call you globalist, you like how that sounds. I'll call you communist. Oh hey, my check from Beijing just clear, where was I? Oh yes. I'll call you banksters, you like how that sounds. I'll call you devils, you like how that sounds. I'll call you well whatever I'm told to. This is the truth movement, baby. We tell truths here, the ones we're paid to tell. We're all about the truth and about the money. Call myself a hardcore Christian, so I'm gonna praise China's new system. Only critique is internal, yo, cause evil from only one source does flow. You're all Satan, we're God. Well, dear leader in Moscow, you're looking for a deal, got a complete package for you, and here it is, if that's alright for you. I'd sell you my mother for a nickel. You can have my soul for a dime. Sell my country for $1, and humanity for a $5. Oh yes I do, oh yes I do. Freedom's collapsing everywhere, and I'm cheering it all. Oh yes I do, oh yes I do. I welcome our new overlords. Oh yes I do, oh yes I do. Freedom's collapsing everywhere.